Hey guys, Logan Johnson here. Today I have a tier list going over what decks I think can win YCS Vancouver. It's in about a week and a half, close to 2 weeks. And I have five tiers here. I have favored to win the YCS, can win the YCS, can top the YCS, unlikely to top the YCS, and I have don't sign up for the YCS. Um, so for these tiers, I think the decks at the top, obviously, I think these will be the absolute favorites. I think can win a YCS. These are decks that I think will have to get a little bit lucky in order to win, but I do think they have a good chance to win. Can top a YCS. These are going to be decks that have, one or two spots in the top cut, probably aren't going to make it super far. Would be very surprised if they do win a YCS, but they could top. Unlikely to top. These are decks that I think if somebody is like very dialed in on a rogue strategy or it's their pet deck or something, they put a lot of time into it. It's possible, but very unlikely for them to top. And then don't sign up for the YCS. I would not even consider bringing this deck. It's just not. It's simply not good enough. With that being said, let's get right into it. First off, we have Old Reliable Malice. This is a deck I played a lot last format. Um, I think this deck is still very strong. I do think its K9 Vanquish matchup is not very good. It wasn't good last format against Vanquish, and I don't think it's gotten better. If anything, I think it's gotten worse. However, Malice is one of the highest ceiling decks. It's very consistent, plays a ton of non-engine, and it plays Dominus Impulse. Uh, and if this deck dodges Lancia for a lot of the day, I do think it can win the YCS. However, I do think this deck does have an issue with single elim and top cut. One bad match against a floodgate like Lancia and your tournament's done. It's just not as consistent post side that as you would like it to be. So I'm going to put it in can win the YCS. Still a very very good deck and a strong contender. Next up we have Blue Eyes, fan favorite deck. However, this deck I have not thought was good really at all ever. It's very very low to the ground. It plays a ton of bricks. It's not it's pretty consistent, but the starters are very weak. They're not. Most of them aren't good into hand traps. Some of them are. Um, I should say they're not very good into hand traps. People are playing right now. They're not very good into Bestials. They're not very good into Ogre. They're not very good into Impulse, Purge, Ash, all those types of cards. And this deck also struggles against Breakers, which Breakers are back in the meta. Um, yeah, the ceiling's too low. The cards are too bad going second. Too many bricks. Unlikely to top the YCS. I doubt it. It's not impossible. If the deck doesn't draw its bricks, it's not a horrible deck, but I'm going to put it in this fourth tier right here. Up next, Memento. This is a deck that won the Seattle Regional undefeated. I do like this deck. I think the engine is very powerful. The engine alone is strong enough to top YCSs and win regionals. However, it does have a problem with non-engine. It doesn't play as much non-engine as you would like. It's usually 13 or 14, maybe 15. Usually the deck has to play over 40 cards. This deck also plays a lot of bad cards and a lot of semi-bricks, and like drawing Gaddock makes a lot of your combos much worse. It's also somewhat weak into the K9 cards. You're always going to be triggering them. But I do think that the engine is strong enough to where if this deck wins a good amount of die rolls and has some good luck and good variance with what hand traps your opponents are playing, and as long as you don't brick going first in the die rolls that you're doing, I do think this deck can go on a good run and top the YCS. Could it win a YCS? Uh, I I don't think so right now. I know it won a YCS last format, but that was different. That deck was like very very built to beat Detonator, and right now the format's too open. I do think it can top, however, the engine is too strong. Uh, Speaking of Seattle Regionals, let's go to Draco Tail. This is a deck I got second with at the Seattle Regionals. I was XO1. Um, I actually don't think this deck is as good as some people think. There's a lot of people who think this deck is awful, and there's a lot of people who think this deck is like the best of the Justice Hunter decks. I'm kind of on the lower end of that. The ceiling of this deck is quite low. Sure, you could have an IP or Seals on your end board. Sure, you could try adding King of the Swamp and trying to get a Dragoons on your board, but it's inconsistent. It uses a lot of your hand. Sure, you could add Fiendsmith cards to your deck. Then you're reducing the number of non-engine in your deck, which is a problem. Going second has a very good Yummy matchup. Going first as well has a very good Yummy matchup. The K9 VS matchup is atrocious. If your opponent does not brick and they play well, it should be like an 80-20 matchup. And that's going to be a large portion of the meta. So I think that alone is probably going to keep this deck from being able to actually win a YCS. However, I do think this deck can top a YCS because, you could play 10, 11 rounds of YCS and only play against 1 or 2 K9 Vanquish if you get a little bit lucky. So I'm going to put this probably a little bit above Memento. I do think there's some stuff you can experiment with this deck and maybe solve some of the issues. And if that's the case, then I would put it up here. But from my testing, I have it right here. Lunalite, this is a deck that I think has done better in the OCG because there's not quite as much Malice and there's no Mitsurugi. This deck doesn't play enough non-engine going second to really stop crazy decks like Mitsurugi. Malice is an awful matchup for it. I also think like Hand Trap Yummy is a bad matchup for it. I don't think this deck is that good. It's more inconsistent than it should be for the number of engine it plays. And the non-engine count is simply too low in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In my opinion. Could it catch people off guard? Sure, yes. If people aren't prepared for it, Liger Dancer is a crazy card. It can, essentially pseudo FTK people. However, the way the deck is built, I don't think it can go too far into a YCS. I do think it can top if the deck is built well and played well. So I'm going to put this similar range as Memento. I do think the engine is actually worse than Memento. So I'm going to put it behind right here. This is Orcus. This deck won Nationals this year. Is very surprising. I didn't think it was a great deck at Nationals. I still don't think it's a great deck. It's got more decks to prepare for. Going second into Yummy, it doesn't seem great. The banish off of Lollipo is like actually relevant. The double book is very solid. I also just don't think that this deck plays enough non-engine to counter some of the crazy decks in the meta. Maybe a board breaking strategy with Orcus is how you would go with this. But I don't think the card quality is as high as the new decks. So I would put this in unlikely to top the YCS. I do think it's a lot better than Blue Eyes. But I do think it's a lot worse than Memento. So you could argue that it could go at the bottom of here, but I think it's unlikely to top. I would put it at the top of this tier. This is pure Mitsurugi. I haven't seen many people talk about this deck. However, I do think it's pretty well positioned in the format. It plays fairly well into almost every hand trap, and it gets to run Dominus Impulse, which is a insane card right now. That card is ridiculous against Yummy. That card is ridiculous against that card is ridiculous against Dracotail. So I think this deck is solid. I think the Mitsu cards are pretty decent into Yummy. However, the deck is low ceiling, somewhat of a non-engine issue, somewhat of a bricking issue. It's a little bit less consistent than you'd like, and it doesn't play as much non-engine as you like, which that kind of is just in this category. All these decks kind of have a similar issue. I think it's probably a little bit worse than Memento. The engine isn't quite as strong. It's not so much an auto win if you go first and you resolve your combo. And its deck is built very similarly to Memento. So if I was taking a deck to a YCS, I would rather take Memento right now. K9 Christian. This is kind of the flavor of the week right now. There's been a lot of videos posted online recently. I like this deck, but I don't love it. I do think it's like one of the most 50-50 decks in the game right now. I don't necessarily think it has many bad matchups. And I think that if it wins the die roll, it should win like a very, very high percentage of the time. Plays very well into most hand traps. Fua is a little bit sketchy, but outside of that, like everything else is pretty much okay, and you can kind of blow through. Going second has some issues. It plays an okay amount of non-engine. It's like 16 or 17. Usually plays chummies and breakers, which I'm not sure how I feel about. It's been a while since we've been able to mix hand traps and breakers. Maybe this is the format to do it. I'm not sold on that yet, but possibly. However, I think just like any deck that has like no bad matchups, I think can win the YCS, because all it has to do is just get a little bit lucky on die rolls, and when it loses die rolls, it just has to get a little bit lucky on non-engine. And I don't think the deck has like any significant deck building flaws. and it has access to a searchable floodgate and clockwork knight post side, which I think is very solid. And I do like that the K9 cards bridge into the Crystron cards, so the deck is very, very consistent. So I think this is a little bit worse than Malice. Possibly better if you can really refine the deck list. But I think right now it can definitely win the YCS. So next up, we have a couple of versions of Vanquish Soul actually. So this is Vanquish Soul with the full K9 package. This is the one that most people are playing right now. And I don't believe this is in the S tier favored to win the YCS category. I'm of the opinion that like Jokul and Lantern and stuff are not very good cards. They play so bad going second into every deck. They don't bridge you into your Vanquish Soul cards. And by themselves, they don't really do that much. They give you like a decent half board, but that half board just gets destroyed by board breakers, gets destroyed by Yummy Engine. And the other issue is the Vanquish deck is only about 85% to see a Vanquish starter. And then you also have to have the attributes on top of that to make it work. So I'm not the biggest fan of this. I also think that when you take out the K9 cards, like the big package, you also get more room for non-engine and more room for consistency, which is why I think that the Vanquish list with X-Drive is actually the best one. So in this list, you still run Azuna, and you still usually run one Jokul to have something good to search off your Ripper. However, you're running 3 X-Drive and you're running Prosp. And all those cards are ways to get you to your Vanquish Soul engine, which is the good part of your engine. That's the part of the engine that's going to win you the most games. And also by cutting down on the K9 package, you actually get to fit in a couple of more non-engine, which does make a difference because it bumps the deck up from 15-ish non-engine to 16, 17, maybe even the 18 range. But yeah, I definitely think this deck is favored to win the YCS. I think it's up there as a top 2 contender. Speaking of top 2 contender, we have Yummy with hand traps. This would be like the Triff list that's been going around. 20 plus hand traps, 22, 23 hand traps. Veilers, Ogres, Bells, all that stuff. Right now, this is the version that I prefer of the deck. I think the hand traps are better in simplified game states. I think they're better when you brick. I think they're better to back up your board. And I also think they're better against any pseudo FTK, like super heavy combo decks. And I also think as the format goes on, breakers will generally get worse because people understand how to build their deck better. They'll understand how to play around breakers better. And at a YCS level, I think hand traps are generally always better because you play against stronger opponents who aren't going to leave themselves open to losing to, a one Dark Ruler, one Evenly, or one Droplet. And I do think that the Yummy engine is so powerful. It's just so many one card starters, so many hand traps, so few bricks that, in my opinion, it also belongs up here at the top. The other variant of Yummy with like songs and breakers, I think this list is good. My opinion at a YCS, I think breakers are very volatile, and I don't think Yummy is a deck that takes advantage of breakers as well as other decks do. When you have so much room for non-engine, 20 plus slots, it almost seems criminal to not play hand traps because drawing 2 or 3 hand traps is just so broken that it's ridiculous. Like you can just cut people off, they'll never get to a half board. Where drawing 2 breakers is hit or miss. There's going to be some decks where drawing 2 breakers against is very good. There's going to be some decks where, you draw 1 breaker and it's good enough, but there's going to be a lot of games where your opponent sets up an FTK board, Malice, you don't want to be breaking that, Ouroboros Loop, you don't want to be board breaking against that. Your opponent can have floodgates, and also just them having their own hand traps in hand is a counter to your board breakers. So with that being said, I'm going to put this right up here with the other variant of Vanquish Soul and can win the YCS. Next up, we have Rizal Mitsu. This was the kind of the deck of the last format. I do think this deck has a pretty good Yummy matchup. I think it's about 50-50 against K9 Vanquish. And then Dracotail, this deck should obliterate Dracotail. I've only tested the matchup a few times, but it seems very, very unfavored for Dracotail. The engine is strong. The engine hasn't changed. It's fantastic. Very, very scary deck. The biggest problem with this deck, low non-engine. the non-engine that you do play, like Fuas and Charmies, um, Perulia, if you brick on those, you don't have any like good hand traps to draw into. So like if you brick on Chummies in other decks, you usually have hand traps to draw into, like Holly Sue, Azuna, stuff like that. Ogres, Valors, Ash. I guess you'd have Ash in this too, but Ogres, Valor, Bell. To live in this deck, you really don't have that. You also play a lot of bad cards in the deck: Night Sword Serpent, Kusa, Saji, all that stuff. So I do think this deck is like maybe the highest ceiling deck in the format. However, it plays so many bricks and so few non-engine that I do think you would have to get a little bit lucky to actually win the YCS with it. But I will put it at the top right here. I would not be shocked if it won the YCS. Art Mage. Not even positive what the name of this archetype is, but something had to be on here to go in the bottom, and I'm going to put this here. This deck is like has no 1-card combos. It's like 2 and 3 card combos. Doesn't really play that many starters. It plays a whole bunch of bad cards. And it doesn't play as much non-engine as you would think it does. It's just not a very good deck right now. Rizal Onima. This is a deck that did well at the Nationals again. I believe Mario D'Amico played it in the playoffs and the main event, and did very well with it at both tournaments. I think this was a good meta call then because it was Ouroborosing a lot and had pretty good compromises into Chummies. You could set up like a detonator and a trap. You could set up like a plugin if you play it. And under Droll, the deck was pretty good if you had access to Ice Rizal. And there's so much malice in the room where like just ending on a detonator was often good enough. And it also just jammed a bunch of non-engines. So I think it was like a pretty solid deck at that time. Right now, though, I think its K9 Vanquish matchup is not great. The Dododo cards play into Azuna. So I think like maybe even a pure variant or Rizal might be better, but I don't really think either variant is fantastic right now. But I don't think it's super unlikely that it will top the YCS. I think there's a good chance that somebody will show up with this deck and will do well with it. I would rather play this deck over Lunalight. I think I would rather play Pure Mitsurugi over it though, because I want access to Dominus Impulse. Next up, we have Sky Striker. Fan favorite deck, of course. Not a good deck in this meta. This is a grind game deck, and the 3 big decks right now, the 3 new decks, all have fantastic grind games and can actually outgrind Striker. Striker could have a good Yummy matchup if you're playing a lot of breakers and stuff. So I don't think this deck is awful, but I think it will take somebody who's very, very skilled with the deck and has, is one tricking the deck essentially to top with this deck. It's just not a high ceiling deck, and it doesn't have great matchups into the meta. So I would put this above Orchist because I do think it has more potential than Orchist. And I do think there's a way to deck build to target some matchups and then hope you play against those matchups. So I'm going to put in unlikely to top the YCS. I think that's a great spot for it. Next up, we have Gem Knights. This was the surprise out of the NAWCQ. This is a deck that we actually tested quite a bit. It's very similar to Tempai. You just go second, you board break, and you try to kill them. I think that this deck was playable at Nationals because it had the element of surprise. People had no idea what the cards did. People didn't even realize this was a deck. I don't think this deck is going to have a lot of representation at Vancouver. And I also just don't think the deck is very good. I think the deck has a lot of problems with different non-engine that people are playing. Purge and Ash, Impulse, all those cards are a problem. DD Crow can be a problem. It is good into breakers because if you make your opponent start and they just have a handful of breakers, you're probably just going to kill them. So I think that is like one of the things that has going for it. However, against all the other reasons, I think is what's going to keep it down. And I would put this probably behind Orchist. I do think it's better than Blue Eyes. I do think Blue Eyes is like a pretty significant drop off from these 3 decks, but Blue Eyes is not as bad as Art Magia. Next up, this is like Azamina, Fiendsmith, whatever you want to call it, pile deck. This deck is kind of like Striker, where I think if somebody one tricks this deck and has been like putting a lot of time and effort into it and adjusting it for the format, adjusting it for the meta, I think it has a chance to top. The problem with this deck, once again, it plays so much engine and it's not as consistent as you would like it to be. It doesn't play a whole lot of non-engine. It does work very well with breakers, which is cool because breakers are somewhat playable right now. Um, However, the starter to hand trap ratio or starter to non-engine ratios is not very good, and you play a lot of bad draws as well. So with that being said, I would put it probably behind Striker and above Orcus, but it's close. Yeah, I mean, you could argue between these two slots, but I would put it down here. And last up, this is Mermail Atlantean. This has been kind of a boogeyman deck for a while, and I haven't seen anybody talk about it lately. The deck hasn't lost anything. Into the meta, I think the Poseidra card is pretty good into Yummy. I think this deck could actually win into Yummy going second. The big problem is obviously Herald of the Arclight. If you can clear that card, you can probably break the board with the Mermail Atlantean cards. Going first, if people are playing breakers, this deck is weird because if you're relying on the Berry Statue lock, that does lose to like droplets and stuff. If you're doing more of like a try to Moulin Glacia them, maybe this deck could be good into breakers. But I do think this deck was like fairly well positioned last format, but not amazing. I think this format has gotten a little bit worse, but I don't think it is a bad choice because you have access to Dominus Impulse. Any deck with a good engine and Dominus Impulse, I think, is going to be a strong contender. And that's why like Lunalight's here, Pure Mitsurugi is here, and I think this falls perfectly into this category. This is a nice, clean chart here. Let me know if there's any decks that I forgot. I think I included everything. There's maybe some, variants of decks. We could talk about Yummy playing hand traps and breakers. But regardless, I think if you're playing Yummy cards or you're playing Vanquish Soul cards, you're going to be favored to win the YCS or can win the YCS for sure. Those decks are just so powerful right now. And I think everything else in this area is good, but would need some luck or some innovation to take it to the next level. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys think a deck needs to be moved up or down. And let me know what you guys are taking to YCS Vancouver if you guys are going. With that being said, appreciate you guys watching. Shout out the Gaming Metro, Johnny Perkins, SK Games, Hub City Collectibles, and that's all for me. Signing off.